Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, party leaders seek to amend China's constitution with a review of the draft amendments. What do proposed changes do to the nation's charter mean for its future? And what a year for U.S. President Donald Trump. We'll talk about the triumphs and tribulations of America's commander-in-chief since he took office a year ago. You are watching World Insight. We start with the proposed amendments to China's constitution. The Communist Party of China has convened a key plenum in Beijing to review proposed changes to parts of the nation's charter. A communique issued after the meeting recognized the inclusion of major guidelines and theories settled after 19th CPC National Congress to the constitution, especially the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. The document has also stressed that the reform in China's national supervision body is a significant move in strengthening the party and the country's self-discipline. The proposal will be explained later in March at the annual session of China's top legislature, the National People's Congress, and a vote on the amendments will take place then. The proposal on the revision of the Constitution was adopted at the meeting. So what do we know so far about the proposed amendment and what's the changes? Take a look at this.
Amendments to the Constitution are to be proposed by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, or by more than 1/5 of the deputies to the National People's Congress, and adopted by the vote of more than 2/3 of the deputies to the Congress. The NPC exercises its powers to amend and supervise the enforcement of the Constitution. The Constitution amending process must follow such principles as upholding the CPC's leadership, sticking to the path of justice of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and adhering to correct political direction. The statement also says the amendment must focus on some parts rather than an overhaul of the Constitution, to make sure that it could not only meet the demands of the party and people, but also follow the rules of the Constitution and Law Department, so as to keep the Constitution's continuity, stability, and authority. The Constitution's last amendment was made in 2004 to include guarantees regarding private property and human rights. In 1999, the amendment was made to include a new paragraph, reading, "The People's Republic of China governs the country according to law, and makes it a socialist country under rule of law." The 1993 amendment included adding a new sentence to the preamble, that the system of the multi-party cooperation and political consultation led by the Communist Party of China will exist and develop for a long time to come. While in 1988, the Constitution was revised to permit the private sector of the economy to exist and develop within the limits prescribed by law.
For more on the second plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee and the constitutional amendments in the pipeline, we are joined by two guests. In Beijing, Fu Jun, Professor of Political Economy with the National School of Development at Peking University. Welcome, Professor. Also joining us in Chicago, we have Professor Dali Yang, who is a William C. Rivas Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome as well, Professor Yang. I want to start with you, Professor Fu. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. Of course, that's a phrase that came up during the 19th Party Congress, concluded just a few months ago. But how much should we look at it with the perspective that China is upgrading its governance and the Chinese Communist Party is doing the same?
Well, if you sort of see the dimensions of his thought, here are principal dimensions. One is we need to be engaged in political construction, engaged in economic construction, social construction, cultural construction, the construction of ecology. At the same time, he set four goals. One is to comprehensively build a moderately prosperous society by 2020. Then that goes up. The other is to make sure we have a very strict discipline for the party, and also deepening the reform in a comprehensive way.
Right. There are a lot of terminologies. Actually, they're very Chinese in a way when it comes to translation of English. But what exactly does it mean? Obviously, it seems that the goal is different from, let's just say, previous generations of leadership when they were facing a very different China. Professor.
Well, early on, there is a big debate whether you take private property very seriously. Now, it seems we have settled that debate, so that part is written into the Constitution. Now, this time, rule of law. Previously, we have been debating about rule by law or rule of law. And in previous documents, two concepts, rule by law and rule by law, rule of law, come up simultaneously. But in this document, it's rule of law that comes up uniformly.
All right, let's go to Professor Yang. Of course, you're based in Chicago and probably have a different perspective as to how this would mean about the upgraded way of governing China, of looking at China, particularly for the next years to come. Professor Yang.
Well, I think certainly we are all very curious and very interested in the upcoming revision of the Constitution. As your reporter has noted, in fact, it's been the current Constitution of 1982 had been revised 4 times, and the last revision was in 2004. The last 4 revisions, each of them actually was significant in terms of emphasizing new elements that China already actually had began to show up in society, in the economy, including private property and the rule of law in those respects. So I think actually people are very interested in looking at this new package and to see how it's going to be adopted. Most importantly, however, the communique from the Central Committee emphasized that it's not a major overhaul. Is going to introduce element and emphasize continuity. And I think actually that's very interesting because it shows the different interests in how they are discussing this particular issue. And in particular, how to incorporate a major new state institution into the Constitution without actually upsetting elements that have already been adopted previously.
This is quite a balance to be taken, of course, Professor Yang. So having said that, though, let's talk about what China is facing and therefore whether these amendments to the Constitution are really likely to address those challenges and address them in the right way. Professor Yang, as you may know very well, China now is different. I mean, compared to 2004, the last time the Constitution was amended. China now becomes the 2nd largest economy in the world, even though it is still a big way behind the United States, but it's already become quite a power. Meanwhile, internationally, the way China expresses itself, the China sees the world, also matters a lot to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, China has already proposed several kinds of policies and schemes in which the world could work together, Belt and Road just for example. So Mr. Yang, at this point, when you see new amendment elements to the Constitution, how they are likely to work with the current status of China in the world? I think that is the most interesting question, particularly to our international viewers. Professor Yang.
Yeah, I think the most interesting aspect is currently the Communist Party Communist Party already actually has the Central Discipline Inspection Commission for party discipline and also for anti-corruption. But as many people know, as the Communist Party leadership emphasizes, this institution sometimes is actually operates in a way that's legally a little bit in the gray area. And I think one of the major developments, therefore, by introducing the State Supervision Commission is to actually incorporate what the party already does and make it part of a state institution as actually enshrined in the Constitution. But of course, constitutional scholars and so on immediately raise the issue that this is almost like a new branch of the state. As a result, actually, it requires more constitutional justification than simply saying that, oh, we need a new institution and therefore let's get it started. Already experiments are happening at the local level in several provinces and cities. So I think actually it's a good sign that the party is taking those objections seriously and saying that, oh, we actually do need to amend the Constitution by actually incorporating the State Supervision Commission into the constitutional framework. But of course, I think actually the communique does emphasize that they want to see consensus and debate and democratic deliberation. And I think people would be watching very closely to see what are the specific details, what are the different interests that needs to be addressed. Because the new commission, how would it work and how does it actually sort of mesh in with the existing legal framework would be extremely interesting. And as you emphasized, China already is such a prominent player globally, and therefore the rest of the world will be extremely interested.
Exactly. Professor Fu, of course, from now until the so-called 2 sessions, when the time the National Congress is being held, that is also the time when the delegates are going to vote on the amendments of the Constitution. There's still a few months to go, but you can expect some debates in different areas relating to the topics Professor Yang just mentioned. Having said that, though, there's another issue. The reason why there's a discussion about amendments to the Constitution is China wants its system to work efficiently. There are several words that they're trying to describe this, centralized, unified, authoritative, and also highly effective. Professor Fu, of course, when it comes to governance styles internationally, there are different styles, different ways, different mechanisms. So when China emphasizes these words, what do you think China is having in mind right now? What kind of message does it send to the rest of the world, Professor Fu?
Well, China has been saying that Constitution is the most fundamental building blocks of a power structure. And to create a new part of the power structure, a appropriate way to go with that so that you have legal authorities that you need to amend the Constitution. As Professor Yang said previously, the party has been going very strong in terms of anti-corruption, but they have been operating in somewhat gray areas. Now, with the new power part of the structure, it is appropriate to be incorporated into the Constitution. So that is all part of the parcel of taking the Constitution very serious. After all, you are creating a very powerful power structure there. And for the market to operate smoothly, theoretically, market cannot work in the absence of rule of law. And this is true not only here in China, but also globally. And I guess another piece of adding to the Constitution is to build a community of shared future for mankind. So to take the legal framework very seriously is an indication that China and also the party is moving in that direction.
Of course, the Constitution is for the country itself. But Professor Yang, here's the thing. There is debate about governance styles worldwide these days, particularly about the efficiency and the procedures to get efficiency vis-a-vis so-called consensus building, which may take quite some time. So how do you see China's own experiments about looking for its own governance style and governance efficiency? How is it likely to contribute to that discussion worldwide, Professor? Yeah.
Well, I think number one, actually whatever happens in China already has a consequence globally. In fact, in foreign aid, in many areas of cooperation with other countries, for example, Chinese companies and institutions, very often when they go abroad, they bring their own practices because that's usually what people know. Executives, consultants, professors, they actually base many of their ideas on the experience that they have. So therefore, whatever happens does matter. Although sometimes, of course, there is a give and take. For example, what happened in some parts of Africa, some of the corporate practices were criticized a few years ago. And that got a lot of attention from Chinese executives and also government officials. And there were changes as well. And I think at the same time, there's a lot of effort also currently by the leadership to say where we can go further than what we already have done. And China has certainly taken a leadership role on the issue of climate change policies. Right. And of course, in this particular context, China really led the world in terms of pushing forward the frontier of global governance.
Having said that, though, Professor Yang, we all know very clearly this year marks the 40th anniversary of the start of China's reform and opening up. So here is the question. Many from the rest of the world wonder, is this going to be continuity in China's determination and commitment to reform and opening up, to be able to challenge itself? Eventually, it would progress. Professor Yang, what's your feeling, given the recent debate on the Constitution amendments, given the recent decision in the proposal, and what about the atmosphere here in China? What does it say to you?
Well, the most striking thing, I've spent many years looking at the issue of reform and the politics of reform. Immediately in the 1970s, at the end of the 1970s, China has gone through a tremendous era of political turmoil and some issues of significant issues of poverty and so on. So the entire country actually was eager for change. So in that sense, actually, economists and political science emphasize it was a moment of reform that was almost what we call Pareto optimal. Everyone benefited by actually engaging in reforms, in opening up. But of course, as China has developed, there are always vested interests that develop. People who actually have gained tremendously in the past now wants to maintain those gains and sometimes want to keep the gains to themselves. And this happens in every society in many ways. So further reform, therefore, actually requires reconfiguring the current setup of interest of institutions and actually also try to actually really take care of those people who are left behind. So in that sense, actually, how to make the development more inclusive domestically is extremely important, and the Communist Party leadership has emphasized that. President Xi in particular has been very adamant about the importance of fighting against poverty. And so globally, I think actually it's also very interesting because there are some concerns that in certain areas China has actually not done as much in terms of opening up. And I think actually a lot of the conversations today are trying to push the equation, push the frontier forward in corporate governance, in terms of the relations between the government and also the corporate sector, and also how do you deal with foreign investment. And of course, President Xi and Premier Li have been emphasizing, for example, administrative rationalization continuously to reduce burdens on businesses and so on.
People say, Professor Fu, there is a will, there is a way. We all know what China's challenges are, and the many challenges China could face if it continues with its current steps of reform and opening up. But I guess, Professor Fu, it has to be done. So how should we see that eternal issue with the lens of looking at today's issue of amendments to the Constitution, Professor Fu?
Well, the amendments at least give us the indication that China is looking at what is supposed to be done in the long term, not short term, not just looking at 5 years. Very importantly, a critical difference this time is the Constitution will enshrine Xi's thought on socialism with the Chinese characteristics for a new era. That means this is a long time horizon. And behind that, if you read the documents this time and the previous documents, there are two daunting tasks that China continue to face. If China continue to move forward, both economic and political. One is we have to deepen market-oriented reforms. In the Chinese terminology, is we must let the market play a decisive role, even though in practice there will be zigzags. But the document says said that very clearly. The other is we must set up a system of rule of law, not rule by law. Of course, you cannot wish those things will up and running overnight. It will take long-term efforts because institutions, after all, are historically and socially embedded. It takes a long time to sort of to build those systems so that China, as well as the world, will have a better chance for peace and prosperity.
As being recognized by many Chinese, and certainly the Chinese government as well as the Chinese Communist Party. The ultimate conflict in this country is the demand for a better life by the public and the insufficient and not yet satisfying development of this economy and this society. We'll see, we hope, with all the actions, that conflict will be addressed. For now, I want to thank both of you professors for being with us. Dali Yang from Chicago joining us, and Fu Jun here in Beijing. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Have a great weekend. Thank you. And stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.